"He's trash," Richard Collins said at the Christmas dinner table, swirling his Cabernet as if he had just commented on the weather instead of the man sitting beside Margaret. The word hung in the air above the polished mahogany table, heavier than the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles. Daniel Brooks did not flinch. He did not defend himself. He simply folded his napkin neatly beside his plate and smiled, the kind of calm, unhurried smile that did not belong in a room that had just turned hostile. Margaret Collins felt every pair of eyes shift, not toward her ex-husband, but toward her. At 66, she had hosted more Christmas dinners than she could count, had basted turkeys at 5 in the morning, ironed linen napkins, arranged centerpieces measured precisely across a 72-inch table so nothing felt crowded. This year was different. This year, she was a guest in the house she once owned, seated at the far end instead of at the head. Ethan laughed first, a short, uncomfortable burst that he quickly disguised by reaching for his glass. Lily covered her mouth, as though the insult were merely awkward rather than cruel. The Christmas tree in the corner blinked with white lights, steady and indifferent. Outside, a thin layer of Illinois snow coated the lawn, reflecting the porch light like a postcard scene meant for families who still respected one another. Margaret placed her hand gently over Daniel's beneath the table. His palm was warm, steady. Richard leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "I mean, no offense," he added, though his tone suggested otherwise. "A janitor? Really, Margaret?" The silverware clinked softly against china. Daniel worked evenings at a downtown office building, the kind with mirrored glass and marble floors. He wore navy coveralls and comfortable work boots, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that did not ask for approval. He had insisted on bringing a pecan pie he baked himself, setting it on the counter beside Lily's store-bought dessert without comment. Margaret remembered the first Christmas she spent after the divorce, how silent her townhouse had felt at 1,400 square feet, how the heating unit hummed louder than conversation. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to prove that her children could accept the life she had rebuilt. Richard reached for the gravy boat, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "You always did have poor judgment," he said lightly. Daniel's smile remained. Not forced, not embarrassed, just patient. Margaret noticed the smallest detail then, the way Daniel's eyes met Richard's without resentment, without apology, as though he were measuring something invisible. The room waited for a reaction, for anger, for shame. It did not come. Instead, Daniel lifted his glass of water. "Merry Christmas, everyone," he said evenly. And somehow, that simple toast unsettled Richard more than any argument ever could. The room did not recover after that toast. Conversation resumed, but it moved like cold syrup, slow and forced. Margaret noticed how Ethan kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his turkey into precise 1-inch squares as though accuracy might protect him from discomfort. Lily adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist and asked Daniel where exactly he worked, her tone polite but edged with curiosity that felt more like inspection. Daniel answered simply, explaining that he maintained the building on West Monroe Street, that he liked working with his hands, that there was something honest about making sure floors were clean and lights were working before the first employees arrived each morning. He spoke without apology, without embellishment. Richard chuckled softly. "Ambition comes in different sizes, I suppose," he said, reaching for another roll. Margaret remembered a different Christmas years ago, when Richard had boasted about closing a 6-figure contract 2 days before the holiday. Back then, the children had watched him with admiration, measuring success in numbers and square footage and stock options. Tonight, the same measuring eyes turned toward Daniel, trying to calculate his worth in hourly wages. Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old reflex to smooth things over, to redirect tension with a joke or a change of subject. For 3 decades, she had performed that role flawlessly, anticipating moods the way she once timed a roast to finish exactly at 6:30 in the evening. But she did not rescue Richard now. She did not correct her children. She let the silence stretch. Outside, a light wind brushed against the windows, and a thin layer of snow slid from the roof with a soft thud. Daniel set down his fork and complimented the cranberry sauce, asking Lily for the recipe. The question surprised her. She brightened slightly as she explained the orange zest and fresh berries she had measured in ounces. That afternoon, for a brief moment, The table felt almost normal. Richard, however, could not leave it there. "You must be very proud," he said to Margaret, the sarcasm barely concealed. "Trading a partner in a logistics firm for a maintenance man." The words were lighter than before, but sharper. Margaret lifted her water glass and took a slow sip. She noticed Daniel's posture had not changed. His shoulders remained relaxed, his gaze steady. There was no defensiveness in him, only a quiet patience that did not match the image Richard was trying to paint. Margaret realized something then. Daniel was not enduring the evening out of embarrassment. He was observing it. The difference unsettled her more than the insult itself. Ethan cleared his throat and asked about property taxes, attempting to steer the conversation towards something neutral, something measurable. Daniel listened carefully before answering, his response thoughtful, detailed, unexpectedly informed. Richard's smile flickered, just slightly. Margaret saw it, and for the first time that evening, she felt the smallest shift beneath the surface, like ice cracking quietly under steady pressure. Richard did not miss the flicker in Daniel's answer. It was subtle, but it was there. The conversation about property taxes should have been harmless, the kind of topic reserved for neighbors comparing assessments over backyard fences. Yet Daniel spoke with an ease that did not match the role he had been assigned at this table. He explained how commercial properties were often reassessed every 3 years, how refinancing could shift liability depending on the structure of the loan, how interest rates in the past 18 months had forced many mid-sized logistics firms to restructure their debt. Ethan stopped cutting his turkey. Lily lowered her fork. Richard's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. "You seem unusually informed for someone who cleans offices," Richard said, attempting to recover his footing with a thin smile. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "I spend a lot of time in offices," he replied. "You overhear things. You read reports left on desks. You learn." The answer was simple. It was also deliberate. Margaret felt the air shift again, the way it does before a snowstorm fully settles in. She remembered the first afternoon she had met Daniel at the building where she volunteered twice a week. He had been mopping the marble lobby floor, moving methodically, carefully placing the yellow caution sign at exactly the right distance from the entrance. He had looked up, smiled, and asked if she needed help carrying the boxes of donated books. There had been no introduction of status, no mention of income, no attempt to impress. Just steady kindness. At this table, kindness felt like a foreign language. Richard leaned forward. "So tell me," he said, voice light but edged. "Do you plan to make a career out of that?" Daniel did not react to the bait. "I plan to keep working," he said evenly. "Work is good for a person. It keeps the mind sharp." Margaret noticed that he did not specify the type of work. He did not explain that he owned shares in the very building he maintained. He did not describe the investment firm he had quietly built over the past decade, purchasing distressed commercial properties at half value and holding them until the market recovered. He did not mention that he preferred walking through his buildings in coveralls because it allowed him to see what executives never noticed. He let Richard believe the narrative he had chosen. The children shifted in their seats. Ethan glanced at his father, searching for reassurance. Lily studied Daniel more carefully now, as though recalculating the equation she had accepted too easily. Margaret sat very still. For years, she had watched Richard dominate rooms with confidence measured in quarterly earnings and square footage. Tonight, she watched something unfamiliar appear in his expression. It was not anger. It was uncertainty. Daniel lifted his glass again, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement of the moment. "It is not the title that matters," he said softly. "It is what you build when no one is watching." The words settled over the table like fresh snow, silent but impossible to ignore. The sentence lingered in the air long after Daniel spoke it, as if even the Christmas lights needed a moment to adjust. Richard leaned back in his chair again, but the movement lacked the earlier ease. He reached for his wine, only to find his glass nearly empty. Margaret noticed the small details the way she always had, the way she once noticed when her children needed new winter coats before they said a word. She saw the tightening at the corner of Richard's mouth, the faint crease between Ethan's brows, the way Lily's gaze no longer held amusement, but calculation. For years, Richard had controlled the narrative of their family. He had defined success in square footage, in revenue charts, in the brand of car parked in the driveway. Margaret had supported him through each promotion, each expansion of Collins Logistics from a modest warehouse of 15,000 square feet to a regional operation with trucks lining 3 states. She remembered the early mornings packing lunches while Richard reviewed spreadsheets, the evenings hosting clients with a smile that never faltered. She had believed in the image they built together. Tonight, that image felt fragile. Daniel did not rush to fill the silence. He took a small bite of turkey, set his fork down carefully, and asked Ethan about his work in software development. The shift was deliberate. Ethan hesitated before answering, explaining a recent project involving logistics optimization. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking one precise question about route efficiency and fuel consumption. It was the kind of question that only someone deeply familiar with transportation costs would think to ask. Ethan blinked, then responded more seriously, his tone losing its earlier mockery. Richard watched the exchange, his expression guarded. Margaret felt something steady inside her, something that had been absent for a long time. It was not triumph. It was clarity. She remembered the night she told her children about the divorce, how they had sat on the same couch now pushed against the living room wall, confused and protective of their father. Richard had framed the separation as mutual, as practical. Margaret had remained quiet, unwilling to dismantle the image of stability they still needed. Tonight, she understood the cost of that silence. Daniel reached for his water again. "Business is unpredictable," he said calmly, not looking directly at Richard. "Markets shift. Debt structures change. It is wise to prepare for that." The words were gentle, almost thoughtful, yet they landed with weight. Richard set his glass down harder than necessary. The faint clink against the plate broke the rhythm of the evening. Outside, a car passed slowly along the snow-lined street, headlights sweeping briefly across the dining room walls. Margaret realized then that Daniel was not defending himself. He was waiting, and in that waiting, something far more powerful than offense was taking shape. The waiting did not feel passive anymore. It felt deliberate. Margaret could sense it in the way Daniel's posture remained relaxed while Richard's movements grew sharper, less measured. The candles on the table had burned down nearly an inch, thin rivers of wax hardening along the brass holders. Dinner plates were half empty now, conversations thinner. Richard cleared his throat and pushed his chair back slightly. "Well," he said, forcing a light tone, "logistics has been strong for decades. We weather downturns better than most." It was a statement meant to reclaim authority, to re-establish the hierarchy that had defined this dining room for years. Daniel nodded politely. "That is true," he said, "until leverage becomes too heavy." The word leverage landed quietly, but Ethan's eyes flicked up immediately. Margaret noticed the change. Ethan worked with data. He understood risk models, debt ratios, exposure. Richard's smile faded just enough to reveal tension. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, still attempting calm. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Nothing personal," he replied. "It is simply that I have been reviewing several commercial portfolios recently. Transportation and warehousing have been under particular pressure. Rising fuel costs, variable interest rates, supply chain shifts." He spoke the words as if discussing the weather, steady and unhurried. Margaret remembered a conversation 2 months ago in Daniel's kitchen, the smell of coffee and fresh paint lingering in the air of his modest 2,000-square-foot home. He had mentioned acquiring a package of commercial notes through a holding company. He had not named the businesses. He had only said, "Sometimes stability depends on who holds the paper." At the time, she had not asked further. Tonight, she understood. Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Collins Logistics is solid," he said firmly. "Our lenders are long-term partners." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Lenders change," he said gently. "Paper gets sold." The room fell silent again. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen seemed louder. Lily glanced at her father, searching for reassurance that did not come. Ethan shifted in his seat, his earlier laughter now a distant memory. Margaret felt her pulse steady rather than race. For years she had watched Richard command negotiations with confidence, had seen suppliers lower their voices when he entered a room. Tonight, she watched uncertainty take root where certainty once lived. Daniel reached for his glass once more. "Business is not about titles," he said calmly. "It is about who understands the numbers behind the titles." Richard did not respond immediately. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the driveway in a clean, unmarked layer. Inside, something far less visible was shifting, and for the first time that evening, Margaret realized that the smile Daniel wore was not patience alone. It was timing. Timing revealed itself in small movements. Daniel did not rush to deliver anything dramatic. He reached instead for the pecan pie he had brought earlier and began slicing it with steady hands, measuring each portion evenly, as though precision mattered even in dessert. Margaret watched him distribute the slices without favor, placing one gently on Richard's plate first. The gesture was not submissive. It was intentional. Richard hesitated before accepting it, as if unsure whether the act carried meaning beyond courtesy. Daniel returned to his seat and folded his hands again. "Since we are discussing lenders," he said calmly, "it is worth mentioning that some notes change hands quietly at the end of the fiscal year." Ethan's posture stiffened. He understood acquisitions. He understood debt instruments. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice lower now. Daniel met his gaze without hostility. "I am suggesting that stability depends on who holds the paper." The sentence echoed his earlier words, but this time it carried weight. Margaret felt the shift fully settle. She remembered a conversation in early November when Daniel had received a call during their walk through the park. The wind had been sharp that afternoon, the lake reflecting a gray sky. He had listened quietly, thanked the caller, and slipped his phone back into his coat pocket. When she asked if everything was all right, he had smiled and said, "It is simply business aligning itself." She had not pressed. Now she understood. Richard pushed his plate slightly away. "Collins Logistics does not deal with strangers," he said firmly. Daniel nodded once. "You dealt with Metropolitan Commercial Bank for 12 years, he replied evenly. "They sold a portion of their transportation portfolio last quarter." The table went silent. Ethan's eyes widened, calculation flashing across his face. Lily looked between the two men, her earlier certainty gone. Richard's confidence faltered for the first time that evening. "That portfolio is secured," he said, though the assurance sounded thinner. Daniel's expression did not change. "It is secured," he agreed, "and it is now managed by Brooks Industrial Holdings." The name rested on the table like a sealed envelope finally opened. Margaret felt her breath steady rather than catch. She had known Daniel was careful. She had known he was thoughtful. She had not known the extent of his reach until now. Richard stared at him, searching for contradiction that did not appear. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He simply continued. "Sometimes the person maintaining the building understands its foundation better than the person occupying the corner office." Snow continued to fall outside, covering tire tracks, softening edges. Inside, the hierarchy that had defined this family for decades shifted without a single raised voice. And in that quiet, the meaning of Daniel's earlier smile became unmistakably clear. No one reached for their pie. The name Brooks Industrial Holdings settled over the table like a second snowfall, quiet but undeniable. Richard stared at Daniel as though recalculating the man in front of him, stripping away the coveralls, the work boots, the title he had used so casually minutes earlier. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice careful now. "You are saying you hold part of the transportation portfolio that includes Collins Logistics?" Daniel nodded once. "Not part," he replied evenly. "A controlling share of the restructured notes." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Margaret felt the weight of them in the stillness that followed. She watched her son's expression shift from disbelief to comprehension, the way a spreadsheet resolves once the correct formula is entered. Lily's gaze moved from Daniel to her father, uncertainty replacing the easy laughter from earlier. Richard cleared his throat. "That does not change the terms," he said, though his tone had lost its earlier certainty. Daniel folded his hands again, patient as ever. "The terms are exactly what change when paper changes hands," he said calmly. "Interest rates, maturity schedules, operational requirements. Sometimes leadership expectations." The last phrase lingered. Margaret remembered the years she had stood beside Richard at corporate dinners, how he introduced himself first, how he spoke over others without noticing. She had once believed that confidence was the same as strength. Tonight, she understood the difference. Daniel did not interrupt. He did not dominate. He waited until each sentence found its place. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. "What are your intentions?" he asked, the question professional rather than personal. Daniel met his eyes. "Stability," he answered. Companies function best when leadership aligns with market reality. Richard's jaw tightened. I built that company, he said. Daniel inclined his head respectfully. You did, he agreed. And building something is admirable. Preserving it requires adaptation. Margaret felt something steady within her, not pride in Daniel's position, but recognition of his composure. He had endured the insult without protest, not because he lacked power, but because he understood it. Richard's earlier laughter now sounded distant even in memory. Lily reached for her napkin, her voice quieter. Why did you not say anything before? She asked. Daniel offered a faint smile. Because it was not necessary, he replied. Titles speak loudly. Character does not need to. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the window, snow continuing to gather outside in clean layers. Inside, the hierarchy had shifted without argument, without raised voices. Margaret realized that for the first time in years, Richard was not directing the room. He was responding to it. And Daniel, still seated in simple navy coveralls, had never needed to raise his voice to alter the balance at all. Richard did not speak immediately. The silence that followed Daniel's words was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, measured, the kind of silence that forces a man to confront numbers instead of ego. Margaret watched the transformation carefully, the way she once watched holiday cookies rise in the oven, knowing that timing changed everything. Richard reached for his phone at last, as if instinctively seeking confirmation. His thumb hovered over the screen, then lowered it back to the table. He already knew. Ethan broke the stillness with a practical tone. If the notes have been restructured, he said slowly, then operational performance clauses would apply. Daniel nodded once. They do, he replied. And performance clauses evaluate leadership efficiency as well. The implication did not need emphasis. Lily exhaled quietly. The earlier laughter felt like it belonged to another house, another family. Richard's shoulders lost some of their rigid lift. You are positioning yourself to remove me, he said, not accusing, not yet defeated, but aware. Daniel met his gaze evenly. I am positioning the company to survive, he answered. The board will review the numbers in January. Decisions will follow the data. Margaret felt no rush of vindication. Instead, she felt something steadier, almost peaceful. For decades she had stood beside a man who believed authority was permanent. Tonight she watched authority become conditional. Snow continued to gather along the driveway outside, covering old tire tracks, smoothing edges. Daniel reached for his water again, taking a small sip before speaking once more. There is no humiliation in honest work, he said calmly. There is only risk in underestimating it. The words were not sharp. They were clear. Richard looked down at the untouched slice of pecan pie on his plate. Ethan leaned forward slightly, now engaged not as a son defending his father, but as a professional assessing reality. Lily folded her hands, quieter than before. Margaret rested her palm lightly against Daniel's arm. She realized that nothing dramatic had happened. No voices had risen. No accusations had flown. Yet the foundation of the room had shifted. The man once dismissed had never needed to defend himself. He had simply revealed what had already been true. And in that quiet revelation, the balance of the evening settled into an entirely different shape. Margaret felt the shift settle fully into place. Not like a storm, but like a verdict quietly delivered. No one had raised a voice. No one had overturned a chair. Yet something irreversible had happened at that table. Richard remained seated, his earlier confidence replaced by calculation. He no longer looked at Daniel as a man beneath him. He looked at him as a factor he had failed to account for. Ethan cleared his throat again, but this time his tone carried a different respect. If the board reviews in January, he said carefully, then leadership metrics will matter. Daniel nodded once. They always do, he replied. Numbers tell the story without emotion. Lily glanced at her mother then, and Margaret recognized the look. It was the same look Lily had worn as a child when she realized she had misjudged a situation. Not shame exactly. Awareness. Margaret did not speak immediately. For years she had filled silences, had softened sharp edges before they cut too deeply. Tonight, she let the silence stand. She reached for her water and took a small sip, steady and unhurried. Richard finally looked at her. Not at Daniel. At her. You knew, he said quietly. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. Margaret met his gaze without hostility. I knew the man I chose, she answered evenly. The words were simple, They did not gloat. They did not seek revenge. They carried only certainty. Daniel did not interrupt. He allowed her voice to hold the center of the room for once. Snow pressed softly against the windows. The world outside reduced to white and quiet. Ethan set down his fork. I should review the performance reports. He said more to himself than anyone else. Lily folded her napkin carefully and placed it beside her plate. The hierarchy that had defined their holidays for decades had shifted without spectacle. Margaret felt no triumph in it, only relief. For the first time in years, she was not defending her choice. She was standing inside it. Daniel rested his hand lightly over hers, not as protection, but as partnership. Across the table, Richard lowered his gaze to the untouched pie. The evening had begun with laughter at another man's expense. It had ended with something far quieter. Respect, recalculated in real time. No one reached for more wine after that. The room had grown quieter, not tense, but thoughtful. The Christmas music still played softly from a speaker near the kitchen, a familiar carol about peace on earth, and Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Peace had not arrived loudly tonight. It had settled in layers, like the snow outside. Richard finally pushed his chair back an inch, not in retreat, but in recognition that the center of the table no longer belonged to him. January is still weeks away, he said, attempting steadiness. Daniel inclined his head. It is, he replied. That gives everyone time to prepare. The word prepare carried no threat. It carried opportunity. Ethan straightened in his seat, professional instinct fully engaged now. If there are performance benchmarks to meet, he said carefully, then restructuring could be strategic rather than punitive. Daniel's expression remained calm. That would be the goal, he answered. Stability benefits everyone involved. Lily glanced at her mother again, and this time her voice softened. Mom, she said quietly, you must have known he was more than what we assumed. Margaret held her daughter's gaze. I knew he respected people who work, she said simply. That was enough for me. The simplicity of her answer filled the space more effectively than any explanation. For decades, she had measured holidays by how smoothly they ran, how perfectly the table was set, how satisfied the guests appeared. Tonight, she measured something different. She measured dignity. Daniel rose slowly from his chair and began gathering plates, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. He carried them carefully to the kitchen sink, running warm water over porcelain with the same steady focus he applied to every task. Richard watched him, no longer dismissive, just observant. Margaret stood and joined Daniel, their movements quiet and coordinated. In the dining room, Ethan and Lily remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the recalibrated balance of the evening. Outside, the snowfall thickened, covering the driveway completely now, erasing earlier tracks. Inside, something else had been erased as well. Not authority, but assumption. Margaret dried a plate and handed it back to Daniel. He met her eyes briefly, not with triumph, but with reassurance. Across the room, Richard rose more slowly than before. He no longer occupied the head of the table. He simply stood beside it. And in that subtle repositioning, the evening found its true conclusion. The dishes were nearly finished when Richard stepped into the kitchen doorway. He did not cross the threshold at first. He stood there as if unsure whether he still belonged at the center of anything in this house. Margaret noticed the hesitation. She dried the last plate and placed it carefully into the cabinet, aligning it with the others the way she had done every December for years. Daniel rinsed his hands and turned off the faucet. The running water stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the heater and the distant carol still playing in the living room. Richard cleared his throat quietly. January, he said, as though testing the word. We will discuss options before then. It was not a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. Daniel nodded once. That would be wise, he replied evenly. Preparation allows transitions to be smoother. Margaret saw something in Richard's expression she had not seen in a long time. Not arrogance, not even anger, something closer to humility, though he would never name it that. Ethan joined them in the kitchen, hands in his pockets, thoughtful rather than defensive. If restructuring is on the table, he said carefully, then leadership roles may need adjustment. He spoke as an analyst now, not as a son. Lily lingered near the doorway, watching quietly, absorbing the recalibration of power without fully understanding how it had happened so gently. Margaret leaned against the counter, Her posture relaxed in a way she had not felt in years. She was not witnessing revenge. She was witnessing consequence. Richard finally stepped fully into the kitchen. He looked at Daniel directly. "If you hold the notes," he said, voice steady but stripped of earlier superiority, "then you hold influence." Daniel did not smile this time. He simply answered, "Influence is only useful when it protects what matters." The sentence lingered between them. Margaret realized that Daniel had never sought control over the evening. He had sought clarity. Outside, the snow had covered the street entirely now, softening everything under its quiet weight. Richard extended his hand after a brief pause. It was not dramatic. It was not ceremonial. It was practical. Daniel accepted it without hesitation. The handshake was brief, measured, respectful. Margaret watched the exchange without triumph. She felt something steadier than victory. She felt alignment. For the first time in a very long time, she was not standing beside a man who demanded authority. She was standing beside a man who understood it. The handshake ended without ceremony. No applause followed. No dramatic declaration marked the moment. Yet something permanent had settled into place. Margaret stepped back slightly, giving the two men space, and for the first time that evening, she did not feel the need to manage the outcome. She watched Richard withdraw his hand slowly, not defeated, but altered. Ethan moved closer to the counter, his voice quieter now. "If adjustments need to be made," he said thoughtfully, "then we should focus on protecting the employees first." Daniel nodded with immediate agreement. "That is always the priority," he replied. There was no edge in his tone, only steadiness. Lily stepped forward then, her expression softer than it had been at the start of the evening. "I am sorry," she said quietly to her mother. "We assumed too quickly." Margaret met her daughter's eyes and offered a small smile. "Assumptions are easy," she said gently. "Understanding takes time." Outside, the snow had nearly erased the driveway completely, covering tire marks, smoothing away earlier impressions. The world looked new under the porch light. Inside, the dining room no longer felt like a stage for dominance. It felt like a room again. Daniel returned to the table and straightened a chair that had been pushed aside earlier. He moved without urgency, without display. Margaret watched him carefully. He had never needed to announce his worth. He had simply carried it. Richard walked back into the dining room and paused near the head of the table. For years that seat had represented certainty. Tonight, he did not reclaim it. He moved instead to the side, standing near the window, looking out at the falling snow. "January," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We will prepare." Daniel joined Margaret near the doorway. His hand rested lightly against the small of her back, not possessive, not protective, simply present. Margaret felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her sweater. For decades she had stood beside a man who measured success by control. Now she stood beside someone who measured it by responsibility. The shift was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was steady. Ethan began discussing potential restructuring strategies in a calm, professional tone. Lily listened. Richard did not interrupt. The evening that had begun with dismissal ended with deliberation. Margaret glanced once more at the Christmas tree, its white lights reflecting against the window glass. She realized that nothing had been destroyed tonight. Nothing had been taken by force. Respect had simply been recalculated. And in that quiet recalculation, she found something she had not expected to feel at this table again. Not victory. Not revenge. Peace.